hard to believe, but it's that time of year again. It seems like it was only yesterday that applicants were grinding through their away rotations and strategizing over preference signaling and using ChatGPT to write earnestly writing their heartfelt personal statements and fake smiling through their 16th Zoom interview. But it's true. Another match day has come and gone. And you know what that means. That's right. It's time to break it down, winners and losers style. First up, a winner, emergency medicine. The biggest story of Match Week 2023 was the news that the bottom had fallen out from the previously competitive market for aspiring emergency medicine physicians. A specialty that was accustomed to having a handful of unfilled slots suddenly had 554. But now, nature is healing. This year, there were only 66 unfilled emergency medicine positions, and honestly, by the time you watch this, my guess is that all of those will have already been snatched up in the soap. So what happened? Did applicants forget what EM doctors went through in the early days of COVID? Are applicants no longer worried about burnout, or the pessimistic EM workforce projections, or private equity encroachment, or any of the other things that were hypothesized as reasons for applicants turning away from emergency medicine a couple years ago? I think the truth is a little bit more complicated. Historically, emergency medicine was a specialty that was heavily populated by graduates of U.S. MD schools. If you go back to 2021, for instance, around 2/3 of all EM positions were filled by American MD graduates. But starting in 2022, MD applicants began to drop. And although those numbers have rebounded a little bit since then, they've never recovered fully. But fortunately for program directors, interest in emergency medicine among DOs and especially U.S. citizen IMGs has increased. Next up, a push. Pediatrics. The biggest story of Match Week 2024 was the soap crisis for pediatrics. But unlike emergency medicine, this one had been building for a few years. The popularity of pediatrics among U.S. MD students peaked in 2014 and it's declined since. Now, for several years, there were enough applicants from other educational backgrounds to fill the holes, but in 2024, there were decreases in the number of DO and IMG applicants as well, and a corresponding spike in unfilled positions. But this year, applications from all groups rebounded a little bit, and the number of unfilled pediatric positions dropped from 249 to 152. So why isn't pediatrics a winner? My guess is that the increase in applications will be transient. If you ask entering medical students on day one of medical school what specialty they think they're going to pursue, which is something that the AAMC does with its matriculating student questionnaire, you'll see that the proportion of students who enter medical school with interest in pediatrics has been steadily declining over time. Over the past 10 years, fewer students have entered medical school with the intent of becoming a pediatrician, and that drop has been offset by greater numbers of matriculants expressing interest in OBGYN, dermatology, anesthesiology, psychiatry, and ophthalmology. So what, you say? Lots of people change their mind about specialties during medical school. But the desire to work with children seems stickier than some of the other ideas that students have when they start school. In fact, if you line up the percentage of students who express interest in pediatrics on day one, right alongside the percentage of MD students who match in pediatrics 4 years later, those lines march downward in lockstep. Now keep in mind, this decrease in interest in pediatrics is coupled with new ACGME program requirements that dramatically cut back inpatient time. And this has led many pediatric programs to expand their cohort so that they can continue to provide wall-to-wall resident coverage for their hospital. With more positions to fill and declining front-end applicant interest, my guess is that pediatric programs next year will be soaping for over 200 positions again. Next, our first loser, family medicine programs. Although other specialties have hogged the headlines for the past 2 years, the hardest to fill specialty was and is family medicine. There are more unfilled family medicine residency positions than any other categorical specialty. And unlike pediatrics and emergency medicine, the number of unfilled family medicine positions continues to rise. Unfortunately, there's little to suggest that any of this is going to change anytime soon. Here are the matriculating student questionnaire data for the most recent class, the class of 2028. Only 4.7% of entering medical students on day one think that they're going to be a family medicine doctor when they grow up. Now, on first pass, that doesn't seem that bad. I mean, that's square in the middle of the pack, right? But remember, there are more family medicine positions to fill than any specialty other than internal medicine. When you compare the number of entering MD students who express interest in a specialty to the number of positions available, well, family medicine has the lowest proportion of all the major specialties. And family medicine is already among the most DO and IMG friendly specialties, so programs can't compensate for declining MD interest by recruiting more applicants from other educational backgrounds like EM. Just like in pediatrics, there seems to be declining interest in the specialty on day one of medical school. So to increase your numbers, you'd have to convince students who went to medical school because they wanted to be an ophthalmologist or a neurosurgeon or an orthopedic surgeon that instead they should do outpatient primary care. As a specialty, it's a tough spot to be in. Next, a winner, dermatology. Earlier today, a reporter asked me what specialty had the lowest match rate. I explained that it's hard to know from the initial data that the NRMP provides because many applicants apply to more than one specialty. So when you look at the NRMP's advanced data tables and see that there were, for example, 1,739 MD students who applied to family medicine residency programs, but only 1,501 of them matched, it doesn't mean that 238 MD students went unmatched in family medicine. In all likelihood, most of those applicants matched to a different, more preferred specialty, and they were just applying to family medicine programs as a backup. But there are a handful of historically extremely competitive specialties where applicants aren't likely applying as a backup, and we can use the preliminary data to approximate the match rate for them. These are things like otolaryngology, orthopedic surgery, neurosurgery, plastic surgery, and dermatology. Now, even among this group, there are applicants who still apply as a backup. According to ERIS data, for instance, there were 6 applicants who applied to both dermatology and orthopedic surgery residency programs this year. But if we assume that the number of these apex level predator gunners like this is low, then we can get estimates of the match rate for MD senior applicants in the most competitive specialties, and they look like this, which means that dermatology was the toughest match in 2025 by a comfortable margin. Next up, a loser. Visa requiring IMGs and IMG-friendly programs. This year, around 18% of PGY1 positions were filled by non-U.S. citizen international medical graduates. Most of them will need work visas to start at their new hospitals. But in January, President Trump signed an executive order directing the Department of State to implement stricter, enhanced vetting for visa applicants. What exactly this will look like for incoming residents is unclear, but it seems likely that administrative delays, scheduling backlogs, requests for evidence, and outright denials are going to impact a sizable number of residents. And then last week, President Trump floated a draft of a new travel ban policy, which would create new restrictions on entering the U.S. for citizens from certain countries. There are 43 nations on the list, but the one that immediately jumps out is Pakistan. After India, Pakistan supplies the single greatest number of non-citizen IMGs to U.S. residency programs. So if this policy does go into effect, it may create major problems for many applicants and leave the programs that match them scrambling come July. Next, a winner. DOs. Another year, another record high match rate for graduating DO medical students. This year, the DO match rate was 92.6%, which is up slightly from last year's 92.3% and now becomes the all-time record for DO match rate. Of course, if you look back, each of the past 5 years has resulted in a new all-time high DO match rate. The DO senior match rate remains very similar to the MD senior match rate of 93.5%, which is unchanged from last year. But that said, the distribution of matches for MD and DO seniors is different. Altogether, DO seniors made up around 21% of active applicants in the 2025 match. So you might expect that they'd fill 21% of positions in each specialty, give or take. But if you did expect that, you'd be wrong. This graphic shows you the actual breakdown of the entering class for each specialty. Now, just for fun, I calculated the ratio of observed to expected numbers of matches for each specialty, and I'll try to turn that into a graphic and post it later on social media. But if you look at that, what you'll see is that osteopathic medical students punch above their weight in PM&R, emergency medicine, family medicine, psychiatry, and pediatrics. But in every other specialty, the ratio of observed to expected matches is less than 1. And for specialties like interventional radiology, dermatology, and the surgical specialties, it's significantly less. In contrast, MD senior applicants made up around 43% of active applicants, but they filled more than 43% of positions in every specialty except for pathology, internal medicine, and family medicine. Next, a winner, transitional year programs. Back in the old days, an internship and residency were two separate things. Over time, there's generally been a trend toward integrating all the training that's required to become board eligible. And of course, to the extent that residency is supposed to be an educational program and not just a form of cheap hospital labor, that makes perfect sense. And along with this, over the past 10 years, there's generally been a decline in the number of PGY1 only prelim medicine and surgery positions offered in the match. But what's interesting is that the number of PGY1 only transitional year positions has continued to increase. Actually, it's more than doubled. I'm not quite sure what's driving this trend. I mean, it could be just compensation for the loss of some prelim medicine and surgery positions, or it could be driven by the demand from growth in advanced specialties that have continued to stubbornly resist becoming fully integrated. But I have a feeling that this is driven by the hospital incentives. Transitional year programs allow many smaller hospitals to plug holes in multiple departments simultaneously. Plus, the programs are easier to get accredited and the positions are relatively easier to fill than prelim medicine and surgery positions. Anyhow, I expect we'll see this trend continue in the future. Next, a push. AI. At this point, it seems pretty clear that we, and here I mean we, not as we in the medical community, I mean we as a human species, are going to look back on this point in time as the inflection point where AI changed everything. This year, I saw more than a handful of personal statements and letters of recommendation that all had that familiar, grammatically perfect, but strangely impersonal tone that you get from an AI chatbot. Now, if you're an old school kind of person, it may get you kind of bent out of shape to read stuff that you strongly suspect, even though you can't reliably prove, was AI generated. But before you get your blood pressure all up, let me tell you that I don't even think that program directors are going to be reading these things for much longer, if they even read them in the first place. Some programs already are using AI to digest applications and screen applicants, and there are a number of high-powered players who are keen to develop and monetize products in this area. So a couple years from now, the residency application arms race may just evolve into a giant bot war, with armies of chatbots writing and optimizing applications for the armies of bots that are actually going to read them. Next, another winner, preference signaling. The AAMC released new data showing just how impactful preference signaling has become in the residency selection process. The graphic here shows how likely an applicant is to receive an interview if they send the program a signal. Those are the gold and silver bars. And how likely they are to receive an interview if they don't. Those are the blue bars. For competitive specialties with high signal numbers, you may have a hard time seeing the blue bars. In anesthesiology, if you don't signal, you have a 2% chance of receiving an interview. Otolaryngology, 1%. And in dermatology and orthopedics, if you don't signal, your likelihood of receiving an interview at the median program is 0%. Residency selection was already a high-stakes Hunger Games type of endeavor, but now deciding which programs to signal has become a high-stakes side quest for many applicants. Do you signal your dream program, or just the one who's most likely to swipe right back? Now, if you're a Match 2026 applicant, come back later this summer because I'm going to update my previous video on strategic preference signaling. If you're not a Match 2026 applicant, you may be wondering why I'm doing all this self-promotion, but the reason is I know some of you all only tune in once a year for this very video, but I try to talk about things that deserve talking about all through the year, so if that interests you, go ahead and subscribe. From time to time, I even make predictions about the future, and actually, I'll go ahead and make one for next year's Match winners and losers. Winner, Class of 2026 4-year emergency medicine matches. Last month, the ACGME announced proposed changes to the length of emergency medicine residency programs. Currently, around 3/4 of emergency medicine programs have a 3-year curriculum. The rest have a 4-year curriculum. But if this proposal goes through, then all residents in the class of 2027 will have to enroll and complete a 4-year emergency medicine residency program. There are a lot of interesting trade-offs here, but one of the big winners is going to be the group of residents who match into a 4-year emergency medicine program next year. Because when those residents graduate in 2030, there won't be a 3-year cohort finishing at the same time. And that means there'll be only a fraction of the typical number of new graduates available in the emergency medicine job market, which should put this group in a very strong negotiating position when they're working on their first contract. Next, another winner, OBGYN. There were a lot of people out there who predicted that OBGYN was going to have a rough time this year. I wasn't one of them. Some folks worried that the reverberations from the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs would dampen interest in OBGYN. Others predicted that applicants would flee after OBGYN pulled out of ARIS and made their own residency application system, Residency CAS. In actuality, despite the political upheaval over abortion access, OBGYN has remained a preferred career choice for many highly accomplished applicants. So many, in fact, that there was only one unfilled categorical OBGYN position. Meanwhile, Residency CAS worked so well that emergency medicine is already signed up to use it for next year's application cycle. Of course, all of this is bad news for the AAMC. It's time, once again, for your annual reminder that the Electronic Residency Application Service is the AAMC's cash cow, generating more revenue than the MCAT, AMCAS, and membership dues combined. And because of that, I warned you a couple of years ago that the combination of preference signaling and a new competitor created an existential threat for them. And if you're interested in revisiting that prophecy, I'll link to the relevant video in the notes below. Next, a push. Statutory antitrust exemptions. Earlier this month, 2 pharmacists filed a class action lawsuit alleging that the matching program for pharmacy residents violates antitrust law by preventing residents from entertaining multiple offers and earning higher wages. The lawsuit names not only the entities that run the pharmacy match, but several individual hospitals as well. If this sounds familiar, it's because this lawsuit appears to be modeled on the one filed 20 years ago that alleged that the medical resident match functioned as a price-fixing conspiracy. Students of history, and of course viewers of this channel, know how that case ended. The plaintiffs never got their day in court. Instead, Congress intervened and inserted, at the 11th hour, into a piece of unrelated legislation, a specific antitrust exemption for the match. So you might think that medicine's governing bodies would be able to just sit back, pop their popcorn, and observe what happens in court with this lawsuit, knowing that they have an ironclad statutory exemption that would keep them from getting dragged into this kind of lawsuit ever again. Well, not so fast. Last week, the House Judiciary Committee announced that it was launching an investigation into the placement of medical students into residency programs. The NRMP, AMA, AAMC, and multiple academic medical centers have received letters expressing concern that the 2004 antitrust exemption is harming residency applicants and patients. Now, my gut feeling is that hospitals are such a strong special interest lobby that it's extremely unlikely that the antitrust exemption is going anywhere. But our country seems to be in a very unusual political moment right now, so for today at least, I'm calling this a push. Next, a loser, the lagging partner. This year, the NRMP reported a match rate of 93.2% for couples. Now, obviously, there's some self-selection that goes into this number. Depending on their competitiveness and career goals, some applicants, particularly international medical graduates, don't even try to couples match with their partner. But even then, this is still an impressive figure, and it certainly represents an improvement from the old days of the match when the algorithm couldn't accommodate couples at all. But there is a catch. The NRMP's algorithm will try to assign each and every pairing that the applicants say is acceptable to them, and for many applicants that includes pairings in which one partner goes unmatched. And this year, that happened to 8.1% of all couples, around 1 in 12. And while I'm sure that the unmatched partner is out there today celebrating their significant other's match success, it's got to be heartbreaking to smile for match day photos holding an empty envelope. And it's got to be a major stress on your relationship to see your significant other go through orientation and start training while you're sitting on the sidelines, even if on some level you think that it's better than if both of you had been unmatched. My heart goes out to these folks, and my only advice for future applicants is to be very thoughtful and deliberate about what you put on your rank order list because you just might get it. Next, a winner. Unmatched doctors. This year there were 9,541 active applicants who went unmatched. It was a gut punch for all of them. Once you go through the gauntlet of getting into and completing medical school, getting stopped before the final step of becoming a physician seems especially cruel and heartbreaking. For many unsuccessful applicants, going unmatched ends up being just a little career detour. Around 45% of U.S. MD and DO graduates who applied again in this year's match were successful this time. But there is a group of applicants for whom this won't be the last time they go unmatched, and for many of them it wasn't the first time either. The group of chronically unmatched applicants is not usually a group that finds itself on the winners list in these videos. However, in recent years, a growing number of states have created pathways for associate physicians, doctors who haven't completed residency training, to become licensed and employed. 11 states now have these licensing pathways, and several others are considering similar legislation. The terms vary from state to state. In Missouri, they're called associate physicians. In Idaho, bridge year physicians. In Arkansas, graduate registered physicians. But regardless of the terminology, the license generally requires a limited scope of practice with a supervisor, and often it has to be in a rural or underserved area. For the unmatched, these programs are a big win, and their expansion is going to give a larger number of chronically unmatched doctors the opportunity to earn a living and potentially even gain real-world experience that will help them get into a residency program. But for society, I'm not sure this is a win. I'm deeply ambivalent about whether this is the right way to go. In the first place, is this really the best way to care for underserved rural patients? Or might we be better off by addressing the misaligned incentives that keep fully licensed physicians from working there in the first place? Even for unmatched applicants, I'm not convinced that this is going to be a great thing in the long run. The supply of medical school graduates is elastic. So when you increase the demand for unmatched doctors, you're ultimately going to increase the supply of unmatched doctors too. Honestly, the fear that their graduates wouldn't find a job is probably the only thing keeping some private equity guy from opening a new medical school at some strip mall in the Caribbean next week. From a societal standpoint, I'm not sure that we want to create a new type of mid-level provider or build a permanent physician underclass of associate physicians if these pathways continue to expand. And now, our final winner, USMLE Step 1 Score Nostalgia. It was 3 years ago that the USMLE began reporting score results from the Step 1 exam as pass-fail, so this is the second match that we've been without the 3-digit Step 1 score. And although we've bravely managed to struggle on without them, many an author has been inspired to pick up a pen and fill the media and the medical literature with warm nostalgia for the good old days. From City Journal, an article called Medical School's Botched Pass-Fail Experiment. This piece concludes, it's time for the USMLE to abandon its misguided pass-fail experiment. From Kevin MD, 2 medical students wonder if Step 1's pass-fail switch actually increased medical student burnout. From JAMA, diminishing objectivity in the residency application process. From Academic Medicine, a thoughtful piece on the shadow economy of effort as students now feel more pressure to distinguish themselves with research and extracurricular activities since they don't have a scored Step 1. And there's much that I could say about all this, and actually I'll try to make some time to do it in a future video because there's many points here that merit a vigorous discussion and a couple that deserve a forceful rebuttal. But today's match day, and I want to stay on topic, so what I'm just going to leave you with is this. For everyone out there today who opened their envelope and was elated to get what they wanted, there's someone else who was disappointed and fake smiled because they didn't. And there's someone else who didn't get anything at all. That's the nature of the match. If you zoom in, it's a zero-sum game. One person's win is another's loss. And that, more than anything else, is what makes medical school and residency selection stressful for applicants. It's not having a scored Step 1 or having to do a research project per se. It's the reality that, at the end of the day, not everyone's going to get what they want. Now, some students would rather compete with a scored Step 1 than with research. Some would rather compete with something else altogether. I understand that, and I understand why. And if we still had a scored step 1, we probably would have a different distribution of winners and losers today. But the overall number of winners and losers is going to be the same because, again, if you view this from the standpoint of an individual applicant, the match is a zero-sum game. One person in, one person out. But if you zoom out and consider residency selection from the standpoint of patients and society, the match is not a zero-sum game. There are ways we can set it up that would lead to better doctors and ways we could set it up that would lead to worse. Remember this graphic I showed you earlier? When students enter medical school, we already have 2 or 3 times more wannabe ophthalmologists and orthopedic surgeons than are ever going to get that opportunity, even in the best of circumstances. But people who don't match, or people who change their mind about their career intent because they think they won't match, they don't just disappear. They go on to care for patients in other areas, and they add value, and they make lives longer and better. And if we're lucky, no one ever even knows that what they're doing now isn't what they always dreamed of. So to me, the question isn't, is it better to force students to memorize skull foramina and viral strand stents, or is it better to force them to do meaningless case reports so that they can become a dermatologist? I don't think either of those things benefits patients or even the winners and losers of those games. I think instead we need to realign the goals of residency selection with the goals of medical education. If we teach the skills that actually matter, and then we decide who wins based on their mastery of those skills, then even the losers end up better off than they would have been if we'd played a different game. But to do this, deans and medical educators, and to be honest, students too, have to stop being cowards and taking the path of least resistance. For today, that's all I've got. Thanks for listening.